and sullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
About 14 years ago, I picked up a book that was rather unique. It was called Family in the Year 2020. And it had an ingenious approach. The futurists who wrote each of the chapters wrote as if they were living in the year 2020. And it was one of those annoying books that you sort of read for a while, then you throw it across the room, and then a few days later pick it up and read some more. But the scenario of those futurists now, writing 14 years ago, 34 years actually before the fact, said that we will have finally arrived in the United States at having free sex, primarily because the two things that inhibit us will be eradicated: sexually transmitted diseases, as AIDS, will no longer be a problem. Unwanted pregnancies will not as well, because the government, when people become teens, will be sterilized. Their eggs, their ova, put in banks. And government will have finally realized that it is in vain to try to regulate the sexual lives of people. But they will regulate the caring for children, because if the couple decides to have a baby, that they will go to the various banks, they will fertilize the egg, and then it will probably gestated in an artificial womb. We will have finally arrived at free sex. And the great achievement, one of the authors says, in separating sexual, sensual, erotic intimacy from human reproduction in marriage, we have finally allowed both experiences to become more fully human and personal. We have received that primal polymorphic perversity, or panerotic potential, Sigmund Freud and Norman A. Brown wrote of as such visionaries. Well, I hope not. And yet, interestingly, one of the authors wrote this, which is rather prophetic 14 years ago, that this will happen. Lesbian couples, again, writing as if he lived then, purchased frozen semen from sperm banks and had their families by artificial insemination. Gay couples hired surrogate mothers who were then inseminated with their mixed semen. Single heterosexual males hired surrogate mothers. Single women called on local storm banks. And that's only 14 years after they wrote, not even the year 2020 yet. What do we do? These authors make no bones about the fact that technology will lead the way, and it will drag us either kicking and screaming or dancing and singing into the future. Well, I would like to just share some affirmations, some values that perhaps that we might try to hold on to in such a world. And the first one is that I would say, from a theological and a practical point of view, is that we should affirm genetic family ties. When my two boys became teenagers, I found that I had a hard time communicating with them. And I was enough of an educator to know that there were communication gaps. But mine seems to be more than the usual. I had what I called a frog in my heart. I had a hard time talking to them about my feelings. And somehow it occurred to me that maybe that was because I never really related closely to my father, who had been an alcoholic all of his life. And so I decided to try to build my relationship with my dad in order to bridge my relationship with my teens. Now, I hadn't read Murray Bowen or other family systems authors at that time. Nobody ever told me that, but I started on a project to get close to Dad. My dad had quit drinking by that time. And so I would go back home to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and try to connect with him. But it wasn't easy. But we talked about his past and some of the things that he did in the past. But when he would call on the phone, it was still sort of the same old surface issues, how the Pittsburgh Pirates were doing or the woodworking projects that he had going in the basement. I tried, but we didn't get very far. And part of it was my problem. I had moved away, and my visits were not frequent. But when my father was 81, my sister called us to say that it looked as if it was the end. He was in the hospital with prostate cancer. And she said, you and Fred ought to come home. And my brother, who also lives in the Chicago area, and I got in an airplane together. And then when we bounced over those Appalachian Mountains towards Johnstown from Pittsburgh in that little commuter plane, I silently made a vow to myself, I'm going to get close to my dad. Well, when we walked into the hospital room, he was very delighted to see us, had enough energy to talk to us. And somehow I got the courage to start talking about the past. And we talked about Kennywood Park and reminisced about the zoo or the circuses we went to. And that was something our family never did when we came together. As you know, alcoholic families are notorious for lack of intimacy. There was so much pain in the past. We siblings never talked about it when we got together. And my father joined in, and the three of us were going at it. And then right in the middle of that, my dad said, I made a damn fool of myself with that drinking, didn't I, Chick? Chick is my nickname. I was startled. I didn't know what to do, but in so many words, I said, that's okay, and it was. I was never angry with him. He was always kind to me, never abusive. That's okay, Dad. And then for some reason I said, do you ever get depressed? Because he was a sort of lighthearted guy, the life of the party. And he said, yeah, I do. And I said, what do you do when you get depressed? And he said, well, I lie here and I talk to Jesus. Now, my mother had told me my dad had made a decision for Christ, but he had never mentioned that to me. But this is the first time I ever heard that he had a prayer life. Now, our conversation that day wasn't long, but it was deep. And I floated out of that room, one of the peak experiences of my life. And I've asked myself since over and over again, why? Why was that so important to me? Was it because I had studied family? Was it because I had studied a lot about intimacy? Or is it that somehow we need to be close to those we ought to be close to? And if we're not, there's an emptiness. There's a hurt inside of us. And by the way, my father didn't die. He lived a couple more years and saw him. And at one time, we prayed together, and I actually heard him pray before he died at age 83, several years later. Our biological ties are special. The Creator has endowed us with inalienable connections. And I think we need to honor those connections. And that somehow when these relationships are good, things are better, and when they're bad, things are bad. Now, not that we cannot be personally whole or psychologically sound without connections to our biological or genetic or extended family. That would be so untrue. Jesus himself told us that he would come and he would separate family members from one another. And it's possible to live without those connections. But having said that, we somehow have to come to grips with the possible cost of the loss of those connections and either seek to develop them or grieve the loss of them. Some research seems to suggest that there's a lot of truth to this. Many of you saw the article about David Ornish, who's treating of heart disease patients, includes support groups, relationships. And in that article, the Newsweek, unfortunately, without any footnotes, gave some of the research of the price of loneliness. Male medical students asked, are you close to your parents? Those who said no, more likely later were to die of cancer or to develop cancer or mental illness. heart patients, do you feel loved? And I realize that's not entirely a genetic family issue, but much of that is. Those who least love, 50% more had arterial damage than those that said they were loved. And other research to suggest that loneliness has a cost, both physical and emotional, in our lives. But there is a threat today towards the genetic family ties, a failure to take into account the importance of it in our lives. And I'd like to speak briefly about some of those challenges. The ones we had mentioned during this conference are certainly obviously there. The use of some reproductive techniques which tend to deny the importance of these connections. And in some cases, very ironic, isn't it? There, for example, in artificial insemination with a male donor, for example, there seems to be, on one hand, a valuing of a genetic connection, a wife who wants to bear her child with her ovum. But on the other hand, the question of the donor's motivation. Is the donor anonymous donor or donor? Is he giving this as an act of altruism or an act of abandonment of his genetic properties? And what do we do with the family jewels? Can we pass them around to strangers? I've thought of that during this time. Would I be willing to be a donor if I were a young man? And I thought, well, yeah, you could make a lot of people happy and encourage them. But then again, what would happen if some Chicago mafia drug lord had a son that he could raise to continue in his trade with my sperm? What responsibility do I have for that? What is the value of our genetic material that we have? Well, secondly, though, broadly speaking, some definitions of the family are sadly missing an emphasis on the family, the genetic family as well. And what has happened here is very interesting, is that people are defining the family in many cases in terms of anything but the biological family. National surveys, several of them, seem to suggest this, that Americans don't think of the family in structural terms as a group of people related by blood, marriage, or adoption, but in emotional terms as a group of people who love and care for each other. George Barna's survey of Generation X and teenagers showed that 75% of them said, family, my best friends are family. And so the whole idea, the whole concept of family is often bypassing the fact that there is a biological family. It's important to us. A sports team becomes a family, or the church becomes a family, or my friends become a family. And the odd thing about this, the ironic thing about this, is that the term family tends to conjure up ideas of warmth and caring and love and intimacy, but we don't look for them in the biological family. And it's a strange irony that's taking place. Now, I realize that many of these discussions of definition are in deference to the many forms of family today, and rightly so. We had a discussion of family ministers in a conference out in Colorado Springs a few months ago, and the 30 of us in that room spent 50 minutes trying to agree on a definition of family, but were unable to do so. Christian family ministers couldn't agree to what the family was. And of course, part of that is they're saying it's because there are so many forms. There's step families, there's blended families, there's single parent families, there's adopted families. However, we should not allow these to deter us from seeing that the primary family, from a biblical basis, is the biological family, and that these other family forms are measured and identified by that, so that an adopted family is a socially recognized relationship between parent and child. It doesn't just happen. It has to be legally, socially sanctioned. But the basic form, the basic pattern over which adoption takes place is the biological family. And it's not at all that we should say that these are second-class families at all. These ought to be highly valued families, and they've always existed because there's always been the death of a spouse or the death of a parent, and there's been orphans and single-parent families. In fact, God has highly valued and honored the whole adoption process by using it as a metaphor for our relationship with him, as Ephesians 1:5 says, that he has predestinated us to be adopted as his children. And so adoption is highly elevated, and as we should recognize all these other forms. But on the other hand, as we think about the practice of reproduction technology and so on, we should also consider that these are different families. Not demeaned, but different. They're not exactly the same. And they are, as a number of you have mentioned, challenged families. In fact, in the Old Testament, obviously, the fatherless and the widows were to be cared for by the nation, and often the prophets castigated the nation because they failed to do so. And James, in chapter 1, verse 27, says that pure worship and undefiled is to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. No doubt, of course, referring to their economic affliction, but perhaps also social and relational challenge that these families face and which need community support. So we want to see these as genuine families, we need to see and recognize they are different, and that an adopted child may go through, not always go through, a typical period of possible rebellion against the adopted parents, or a time of search for personal identity because he or she is not in the biological family. And step families and blended families need to recognize the potential conflict in those families. And one of our major advices now is to stepfathers is to say, do not act as a father to your stepchild. Oftentimes kids who are smarting and grieving the loss of a parent through divorce or death are very resentful of a stranger coming into the house and telling them what to do, and often creates a great deal of rebellion. And we advise these stepfathers, many of them Christian men, who say, boy, this woman's having all this trouble with the kids, I'm going to marry her and I'm going to straighten out those kids, and creates chaos and havoc. And some studies show that it takes 5 to 8 years for a bonding process to take place between a step-parent and a child. It can happen, but it must be taken very carefully. And single-parent families. I certainly wouldn't be opposed to a single parent adopting a child. With community support, many parents have done so, successfully raised children. But on the other hand, the single parent needs a great deal of community support and opposite-sex persons who have an influence in the life of the child. And David Blankenhorn has documented so ably and powerfully what happens to children of single parents if they do not get that support. Another way we are denying family relationship, or disregarding the genetic family relationship, is by denying intentionally some of these relationships. There's a tendency for us to neglect or deny particularly extended family relationships because we have disregarded the possibility of those relationships being important. The kibbutz in Israel, that communal experience, one of the first major breakdowns when they tried to have all families treat each other equally, that all adults were to treat all other children alike. It broke down. Do you remember where it broke down? Well, the most obvious place. Grandparents could not keep from coddling their grandchildren. And I could digress here now and talk about my 8 grandchildren. and what it means to be a grandchild or grandparent, it is absolutely great. And yet, there's a woman who just called Ginger and me the other day, and I spent an hour with her, and then Ginger spent another couple of hours, or how her children are denying her time with her grandchildren because they disagree with some of the decisions that she's made in life. And we try to counsel even people who have alcoholic grandparents to still try to get your kids related under a controlled, safe situation, but try not to deny them that relationship because it may be important to them to do so. Or what about the relationship of ex-husbands and ex-wives with the bitterness of divorce and what happens in those cases of alienation and the tendency to deny or to neglect those relationships? My daughter is divorced. She married a man who later became an alcoholic, and he divorced her, and she's remarried. And since then, her former husband, Joe, has gone treatment, 3 programs, and finally the 3rd one took. And she makes sure that her daughters, his daughters and her daughters, see him on a regular basis. And not just visitation. He comes over to the house for birthday parties, and Becky does a lot of work with divorced women and men who are divorced, couples who are divorced. And she knows a lot about the pain and the brokenness of all of those kinds of relationships. And she sees how there's so much alienation between the exes, etc. And she says she's tried to develop that relationship with Joe. And the other day, they were both, Joe and her ex and her husband Wayne, were remodeling the den together out there as carpenters, working together on the house. And she said, I wish I could invite all my friends here to look at this. Now, I'm not suggesting all people can handle this, but they could, as Christians, know something about forgiveness and the waning of anger and recognize that these genetic kinds of relationships are important. I think the other way we may disregard this is by disregarding the childhood family experience. Now, there's a lot in our society that is telling us the importance of those early childhood moments with our families. Now, there are 2 major films recently. If you haven't seen The 1,000 Acres, dealing with second sexual abuse, it's a dramatic portrayal of the problems there. Or the recent film, Good Will Hunting, the Academy Award-winning film. We are being bombarded by the fact that people are hurting because of what happened in their families. And yet I still meet so many Christians who resist the realization of this. Having come from an alcoholic family myself, I welcomed the literature on adult children of alcoholic 10 years ago when it first came out, and I began to see myself in a new light and to make changes in my life that were about problems that have been with me for many, many years that I've struggled with. But somehow a lot of Christians are saying, well, 2 Corinthians 5:17, and quoting the mistranslation that if any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. All things have passed away. Old things have passed away, and all things have become new. Well, it doesn't really say that. It just says, old things have passed away, and behold, new things. There are still old things there. And yet the tendency to deny these on the parts of many of us for spiritual reasons. The head of our counseling center says that so many students will come in to him, and he's counseling them about a problem, and he'll say to them, what was your childhood family like? And they'll say, well, I came to Christ at age 18. That doesn't matter now. That's in the past. I was out at Talbot Seminary several weeks ago, and was introduced to a man who's teaching a course there. They started a special course for seminary students to deal with their past and their personal problems. And what it is a course that runs for a whole semester, and there's a support group, small group, there's reading about past, there's dealing with past issues. He said some of the faculty members have come in, older faculty members that have begun for the first time to deal with issues in their long-term issues in their life. And I said to him, about how many of your students do you think have some major issues to deal with from their childhood families? And without batting an eye, he said, 90%. And I said, hey, this is California. That's your problem. I asked the man who was once director of placement here at Trinity, one of our vice presidents, who knows a lot about our graduates and knows a lot about the churches that our students go to, and I asked him once, how many of our students have some serious problems from their childhood families that will probably hurt them in their ministry? And he said, probably 40%. But that's not unlike the rest of the population. Secondly, besides affirming the genetic family, we should affirm the commitment to marriage and family. And the emphasis here on commitment, to recognize that marriages are going to hold together only when there is commitment to do so. When my wife, Ginger, and I were about 4 years into our marriage, she shocked me by saying, you know, Chick, I really wanted to leave you during those first 2 years. I'd never suspected this. We had had some things we couldn't communicate about. And I was shocked. I thought, well, they weren't so bad for me, and who would want to leave me? How could this be? And then she said, and I quote her because it was such a dramatic moment in my life, she said, I didn't leave you because God doesn't believe in divorce, I don't believe in divorce, and my Aunt Via didn't believe in divorce. And her Aunt Via had raised her as a teenager, and before our wedding, she shook her bony finger at her, and she said, you stick with that man. And she did. And we have something wonderful going today after 45 years of marriage, but it didn't come because we were instantly compatible. It came because we were intensely committed. And that commitment, exemplified by what Ginger said from a biblical point of view, is threefold. It is a personal commitment. It is a socially sanctioned commitment, one that is held together by society. And it is a divinely sanctioned commitment. And the word in the book of Proverbs about the adulteress exemplifies so powerfully the two of them. The adulteress is one who has left, abandoned the partner of her youth, and ignored the covenant that she made before God. And we badly need to teach this today and let people know that marriage is a covenant and family is a commitment that we need to keep. And there's good news and bad news about the divorce situation today. The good news is this. Do you realize that 80% of the people who are married today are still married to their first mate? 8 out of 10 are married to their first mate. However, there is the bad news, because what is happening is that this has been changing. And it depends on who you're talking about, because people at my age, married when I was married, do not divorce at the same rate as people today. If you were married in 1880, that should be not 1980, 1880, there was a 10% chance that you would divorce. By 1950, that had risen to a 30% chance. By 1970, 50%. And some shockingly are saying the possibility is that people married in 1990 and beyond will divorce at a rate possibly as high as 67%. Now keep in mind that these are only predictions. But nonetheless, it is alarming and comes to the future as to what will happen and what families will be fractured. I think the other part of the bad news is that people are not giving it as much of a chance. Remember, most divorces occurred, that is, the peak period of divorce was around 6-7 years. We talked about the 7-year itch. People tried it for 7 years and then they bailed out. Now that's down to about 4. And the peak period is then, and people are not giving it as much in the past. And this commitment, so important, is being challenged just like the genetic family is being challenged. And I want to mention briefly two things. One is the fact that it's being challenged by a new view of church and family. Now, for years, we have struggled as pastors and lay people with the balance between church and family responsibilities. Are they companions or are they competitors? And pastors have often complained, people go camping or they don't bring their kids to church and the family doesn't cooperate. And there have been various sides on this issue, but in recent times there has been one of the most overt challenges of this by a man by the name of Rodney Clapp in his book Families at the Crossroads and other articles that he's written. For years, he says, it has been popular among evangelicals to list 3 lifetime priorities in this order: God, family, and church. In these popular rankings, family usurps the place that the New Testament assigns to the church. And so Clapp wants to make it this way: God, church, and family. That concerns me, because I think many people will use this as a basis for neglecting their family, and grown adults will use it as a basis for neglecting their relationship with their parents. And I would like to think of it in a different way, not as God, church, or family, or God, family, or church, but rather recognizing that both of these are created by God, and both of them are ordered by his kingdom and his laws and principles of righteousness and morality. And that sometimes we have to sacrifice the family for the church, and sometimes the church for the family. And that these are always going to be held in tension with one another. And we cannot put the church first any more than we can put the family first. After all, the Apostle Paul says that the family, first of all, should take care of widows, not the church. And then only should the church care for widows. So family responsibilities are still there. Clapp says, well, Jesus said, "Who is my mother and my brothers but he who does the will of God?" And that Jesus displaced the family. But it was Jesus who castigated the Pharisees because they had an arrangement to enable people to neglect their parents, and said they were not honoring the 5th commandment to honor their parents. Another thing that is tending to move us away from our concern for the commitment to family is what Clapp says about the commitment to extended family. Jesus, he said, has freed adults from concern for their parents. They're looking ahead in the gospel that he said the 5th commandment is no longer operative, and therefore, if they choose by love to relate and care for their parents, they may do so, but that he has done away with that kind of responsibility. This concerns me, and that I wonder if we can maintain the commitment to family if we are going to articulate things in that way. And we need to realize that seeking first the kingdom of God means going around the world as a missionary to share Christ, but it also means going around the block with your wife to share yourself. That seeking first the kingdom of God means kneeling to pray to your Heavenly Father, or it means kneeling to play with your child. Finally, we need to affirm community. And that would be my last point. I think what Ron D. Clapp has done as a favor for is writing a book that has a strong affirmation of the need for community in our churches and for us to be community builders. I tend to agree with people who say that one of the major problems today is not just the family, but it's the lack of community. And that what nuclear isolated families has lost is their community support. And that without that support, it is difficult to raise our children in the faith. I mean, it used to be many years ago that your neighbors and the policemen supported your values and your morals. Now you can't even be sure of that. And the knee-jerk reaction to this is for us to move into communities, or move the church into being a community and to develop it. And I would say we need a church to be one that has intimate relationships. The church is not a family. The family metaphor is used of it, but the church should be family-like. We should have intergenerational relationships. And what we badly need is for generations to interact together, and for older people to model for others the faith. But oftentimes those relationships are so superficial, there is no bridge for modeling. We need communities that have accountability. In fact, the whole idea of community is accountability. Today, however, we're going to have to enter into that voluntarily, since in the past we were forced into community that restricted us that had sanctions upon us. Now we're going to have to join those communities, and then communities of compassion. Perhaps David Wells, the theologian from Gordon Seminary, is right when he says that maybe the greatest apologetic that we have today is the opportunity to share Christ with people who are living without him and ending up in catastrophe. Is that their experiments with life without God are going to lead them to such suffering and pain that we can offer Christ to them. And maybe that's where the technological revolution is going to take us. And that's not such an old idea, is it? Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Joseph Parker, prominent English pastor, said over 100 years ago, "Preach to the suffering and you'll never lack a congregation." We have problems, but somehow we have to be a bit optimistic and say as well we have opportunities because of the changes that are taking place in our world.